Welcome back to part 2 of Questionnaire Design. In this section, we will continue to look at the components of a good question. So a good question should be simple. It should use simple language and keep questions short. Let's take a look at an example that might be less useful. Did you have myalgia? For many of you sitting at home, you might be wondering what myalgia is. So a better question in terms of simplicity would be, did you have muscle aches? Clear, and so those with less than a certain level of experience and or understanding might be able to get at what you are trying to ask. Importantly, each question must only ask one question. Sometimes it is possible to have two questions in one. Let's take a look at this example. Did you eat mashed potatoes and giblet gravy? Hopefully you will see that there are two questions being asked here. If you ask it one question at a time, it would look a little like this. Did you eat mashed potatoes? Yes or no? If yes, did you eat them plain or with butter? With giblet gravy? So you're giving your participant the option of stating or telling you what they had their mashed potatoes with, if they indeed had mashed potatoes. You also want to make the options to your question mutually exclusive. If you take a look on the left-hand side, we ask the participants here, what is your age? The participants' response options that are given is 18 years old or younger, or 18 years old or older. If the participant is 19, then they'll choose option B, or the second option. If the participant, however, is 18 years old, they might choose either of the two, and so they are not mutually exclusive. So a better option would be on our right-hand side, what is your age? 17 years old or younger, or 18 years old or older? When we're asking question in reference to specific date or time, we need to ensure that these specific dates and time are included in the question. One of the reasons for this is because they help to improve recall of the participant. A less useful example would be, have you been swimming in a public pool recently? Recently is relative, and so a better question would be, did you swim in a public pool between Monday, June 2nd and Monday, June 9th, 2004? Again, because we're asking people to recall a specific time, it is important to give those specific reference date. Our next few slides will take a look at question types. The major types of questions that are used in a questionnaire often includes open-ended question, fill in the blank, close-ended questions which can be categorical or ordinal in terms of their responses, and the data collected and the analysis options may differ depending on which of those three types of questions you have chosen for your research. An open-ended question does not provide response option or choices, and therefore the responses by the participant is potentially limitless. They are useful when you're trying to characterize attitudinal questions, belief, or behaviors. They are usually limited to hypothesis generating activities, but does have some usefulness in hypothesis testing. They oftentimes yield qualitative or categorical data, and they may also yield unanticipated answers that will contribute positively to one's study. So all in all, it is often good to have open-ended questions in your research, particularly in survey research. An example of an open-ended question would be, what restaurants in Montego Bay, and this is very big tourist attraction in Jamaica. What restaurants in Montego Bay did you have a meal between December 3 and December 10? Where did you shop for groceries eaten the week before your illness? These are open ended questions that the participant can give a myriad of responses to. Fill in the blank do not provide response choices, but rather require short responses of one or two words. They are used to measure simple respondent attribute, such as a date that is being collected or quantification of number of years attended school. It might also be asking attributes like race, gender, and these are very simple questions that can be used in a fill in the blank setting. They are usually most appropriate when the question is measuring respondent characteristic versus attitude, beliefs, or behaviors. So again, as a kind of reminder, when we're talking about attitude, beliefs, or behavior, we tend to do open-ended question, or it can be response options, and we talk more about those close-ended questions. Fill in the blank often require categorization and coding of the responses, and they are most appropriate when possible response categories are too numerous to list. And so if we're asking what is your race, and we believe that there are multiple races that are there, and we want to just ask people to write that in because people might self-identify differently, we can just leave that as a fill in the blank. They oftentimes yield qualitative or what we call categorical data. An example of fill in the blank is county of residence, age in years, number of children under the age of 18 in your household. These are all common fill in the blank questions. The close-ended questions, the response choices are usually provided. And these responses can be categorical, meaning that the categories have no particular order or inherent numerical value with respect to one another, or they may be ordinal responses where the responses are describing a range of choices and they do have some amount of quantitative value with respect to each other. Okay? So if we ask highest level of schooling, secondary, or what we call high school versus middle school versus elementary versus pre-kindergarten or pre-elementary, that will have a hierarchical or quantitative value as you move from highest to lowest. When you do close-ended questions in your questionnaire, as a researcher, you should anticipate likely responses. You're also present the responses as a list of mutually exclusive choices and state the responses clearly and concisely. However, there are times when there are unanticipated responses or options, and so it is usually best if an other option or other specified option is placed on that particular question if you believe that there are responses that you might not have considered. They usually yield quantitative data, preferably for self-administered and hypothesis testing questionnaire. However, they can be used in hypothesis generating questionnaire as well. So an example of some close-ended question would include, did you attend the wedding on the 22nd of October? And the options are yes or no. How many pieces of chicken did you eat? Less than one, which is zero or half of a piece of a chicken. One piece of chicken, two pieces of chicken, three or more, or you're not sure or you do not recall. And these are good options to include. You're not sure or do not recall, because you cannot anticipate that every question that you ask, your participants would recall the answer or the situation that they had experienced during that time you are questioning them about. So which question type should be used? It depends on what type of information you need. So again, you're choosing your question type based on the kind of information that you would like to ascertain. What are the expectations about the information? If it is early investigation, you may use some open-ended question. If it is a later investigation that you are investigating the relationship between two variables that you are quite aware of, that there is a relationship based on your literature review, then you might want to use your close-ended questions. The wording depends on the knowledge of the problem, the hypothesis being tested, the information being collected, and the affected population. And it is key that you study your population. If it's a population in which there is low literacy level, you want to make sure that your question is very simple. Okay? If you're asking questions of a technical population, let's say you're asking a survey among healthcare workers, you would be careful also to ensure that you're asking them specific questions that might meet their own definition of what those terms mean. How should you word your question? Use language the respondents can understand. Limit each question to a single idea. Word each question as precisely as possible. And do not phrase questions in a way that suggests a response. Those are what we call leading questions, which you are leading the respondent to a particular answer. So you want to phrase the question in a neutral way. Always include a don't know or a refuse category option because, as I've said before, an individual may not know or not remember, cannot recall the specific response, or might outrightly choose not to answer the question that you're asking, particularly if it's a sensitive question about, let's say, income or sexual relations. What about non-English speakers? If you're asking your question or conducting your survey in a population that might have people of different nationalities who don't have as their first language English, then you might want to test translate questionnaires with native speakers. So back translate to test the translation, or you might want to ensure that the language is simple enough that non-English speakers or people who are not English dominant can understand. On this slide, we're going to look at some principles for writing questions. If we're using scales, the scales are always relative to the respondent's experience. Scale should allow for maximum variability. So when we're asking about attitude, so strongly agree to strongly disagree, we should ensure that there is maximum variability. We should use a balance scale. Again, if we're talking about a statement and you're asking individuals if they agree with your statement or they disagree, you shouldn't have strongly agree and not have strongly disagree. So it should be balanced. Be careful about responses of neutral or no opinion versus don't know, because again, it depends on what you're trying to measure. Are you trying to find out if the person's response is neutral or if it's a no outrightly? And so that must be carefully considered. Use item in a series response categories carefully. So for example, if we're looking at broccoli, chocolate, flour, sugar, and eggs, ensure that we place these items in a specific sequence that we would want the participants to view them in. Because we might put things at the top which suggests that they're more important, which kind of leads the individual to think that this is the right option that they should choose. And so you want to ensure that they're either randomly placed or they're placed in a specific order to guide the question that you're trying to ask. You want to place response categories vertically because people tend to read vertically as opposed to horizontally. A questionnaire gets people to express their feelings, their perception, behaviors, and experiences, both past, and present, and therefore you want to avoid asking for second-hand information. Avoid also asking hypothetical question. If you could be an expert on any subject, what subject would that be and why? Those questions are not real about the person's perception, behavior, or experience. They are more hypothetical and less useful. Avoid asking about causation. So avoid asking, does smoking cause lung cancer? If you're asking someone's perception or belief, go ahead and ask them what is their belief on smoking and lung cancer, rather than asking them about does smoking cause lung cancer. And avoid asking for solutions to complex issues. Having completed your questionnaire, the next step is to pilot this questionnaire. To pilot means to ask the question of a similar group of individuals to the population in which this questionnaire is going to be administered. Be careful not to do the questionnaire in your, or administer the questionnaire in your population that you are going to be included in your survey, because again, you want to keep that as confidential as possible until the time of your study. So, are the questions yielding the information that they're supposed to? Is one of the questions that the pilot testing will bring forward. Do respondents understand all the wording? Do the respondents interpret the questions the same way each time? And do close-ended questions have a response option that applies to each respondent? Are skip patterns followed correctly? So remember earlier we spoke about if yes. Those are kind of like skip patterns that says if yes, go to this question. If no, skip these questions. We're now going to go through an exercise just to kind of cement or to reinforce what we have covered in questionnaire design. Consider a foodborne outbreak in which a product from a local restaurant appears to be implicated. What kinds of questions would be most useful or most important to ask? And in what order would you put the questions? And what type of questions would you ask? Open-ended question, close-ended questions, or fill in the blanks. I want for you to consider this example and think about some of the questions that you would ask. The other thing I want for you to do on your own time is to go through these examples that I have of good or bad questions when you're thinking about the questions that you are going to develop for your exercise. Have you ever been evaluated for hypertension? That might be a bad question, and a better question would be, has a physician or healthcare provider measured your blood pressure to determine if you have high blood pressure? More specific, more detailed, less ambiguous. Another example is, childhood immunizations are important ways parents can protect their children against serious diseases. Has your child been immunized against measles? You guessed it. This is a leading question. Having told the individual that childhood immunization is an important way to protect against diseases, they are going to say, yes, their child has been immunized. So you have led them to an answer that they should be given. A better question would be, has your child been immunized against measles? Full stop. And allow them to respond. So that's about it for questionnaire design and the end of week 2. I have some references here that you are free to check out and look to gain more information on questionnaire design. And please remember that on your own time, you need to take a look at the case scenario that was presented at the end of this lecture and develop your own questions and state the specific types of questions that you would utilize.